Karen, and thank you also to all the panelists of the first session. Now we're going to panel 2, which consists of 2 presentations, and which is entitled Non-European Jews in Belgium, the Netherlands and Beyond. And so in this time of all being stuck at home during a pandemic, we're now going to do itinerant traveling. And we start this with Thomas Verbruggen. Thomas Verbruggen, who has a master's degree in history from the University of Antwerp with a thesis, Under the Moon and the Stars, the Impact of the Great War on the Ottoman Sephardic Community in Antwerp, 1870 till 1930, and who last year became doctor in history as well at the University of Antwerp and the Free University of Brussels with a PhD entitled Maids on the Move, Foreign Domestic Servants and Intermediary Structures in Antwerp and Brussels, 1850-1910. So Thomas, we're very much looking forward to your presentation, which will virtually make us move to other places and will bring us the dynamics of resettling and mobility. So without further ado, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. What I will present today was actually a research proposal I submitted to the Research Foundation Flanders 1.5 years ago. However, by the time they accepted my proposals, I was lucky that they accepted my proposal. I was already working as a software engineer and decided no longer to pursue a full-time career in academia. However, that does not imply that I no longer want to study itinerant traders. It only means that it will take a bit more time to do so. I will start this presentation by briefly pointing to a few challenges within migration history and theory. And by pointing out how studying itinerant traders may help us to meet these challenges. In doing so, I will use the case of an Eastern Sephardic family who somewhat justify my presence here at the Joodse Contacten. And from this case study, I will move on to the main, very briefly, to the main objectives of this research and in time to leave enough room for the next presentation and questions and suggestions, of course. The starting point of my research is, I believe, summarized best in the work of Bekel, De Haas, and Kubel, all social scientists who claim that migration research in general, so not only migration history, focuses almost exclusively on established migration systems with an existing diaspora community at the place of destination. And this bias, in their opinion, has left many questions regarding recent migration history unanswered and leaves us as migration researchers with several challenges. First of all, there is a major lack of understanding how new migration trajectories are explored. Second, migration researchers continue to struggle, or migration theory continues to struggle to explain the recent emergence of so-called superdiversities, so cities where we have a lot of small minorities instead of one large majority and maybe one or two minorities. And related to this, third, a major share of international migration, both in past and present societies, occurred outside dense migration circuits. And still somewhat puzzles migration historians and social scientists today, relying on theories about migration networks, etc. We see that in the work of Clay Lesker, Marloes Grover, Leo Lucas, Leslie Page Moore, and others. They all have observed that an important share of migrants migrated outside dense migration circuits do not seem to have close connections with their place of arrival, etc. And I believe that studying these kinds of migrants is, of course, interesting as well, and maybe has some link to this emergence of super diverse cities. In my opinion, an interesting group among these, smaller groups are itinerant traders like the brothers Jacques and Rafael Alcolombre. apologies if I do not pronounce their names correctly. I'm not an expert in that field. During their lives, they were identified as colporteurs or peddlers, hawkers, négociants or traders, commerçants, représentants de commerce or sales representatives, etc. And the diversity of the ways they were identified in the Belgian sources seems to have been characteristic for what I call itinerant traders at the time. So I've already studied some cases, and this repeats itself. So we see that they are identified at different moments in time. They are identified differently. But always as some kind of itinerant traders. The brothers were born in Istanbul in an Eastern Sephardic family. In the Belgian sources, they called Israélite Levant, and moved with their parents to Cairo around the turn of the 20th century. Raphael arrived in Antwerp in 1910, coming from Paris, France, at the time when he was 31 years old. And he was identified by the Antwerp authorities as a peddler selling candy and other confectionery in coffee shops, pubs, inns, hotels, etc. And he probably moved along after staying a few months in the city. His brother Jacques, of whom we see a picture here, which is present in his foreigner file, arrived in 1914 at the age of 18 in Ostend by the North Sea. And just like his brother, he was first identified as a peddler. And in the coming months, he traveled around Belgium with brief stays or more lengthy stays in Antwerp, in Brussels. But as soon as the war broke out, he left Belgium and went to Turkey. And during his first brief stay, he was not only identified as a peddler, but also as a sales representative, wage laborer, and even as an electrician. So he clearly combined different professions to make a living, which somewhat fits with what we know about itinerant traders at the time. And what this also perhaps implies is that his brothers were not very wealthy, but nonetheless managed to make a living and finance their travels, and with a variety of activities. 10 years later, the brothers returned, this time coming from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and they returned to Brussels and its surroundings. And this time, Raphael, I got a bit confused there. So the oldest brother was identified as a trader in stockings and furs. So it seems that he had some kind of social mobility. And he was helped by his brother in his business, and they continued to travel around with stays in Madrid, Lisbon, Turin, and previously mentioned cities. But these are only the places that I could find in the Belgian sources. So it could be that they went to many other places as well. However, after traveling around for a few years, they finally settled down in Belgium and fell in love with Belgian women, and also married them. Raphael with Mathilde Mertes and Jacques with Henriette Kroekaert. And Jacques and Henriette got a son who they even named Albert, which was the name of the Belgian king at the time, coincidence or not. Now, what interests me about Jacques and Raphael Alcolombre and other itinerant traders is that they were not wealthy, especially not when they arrived in Belgium. Unlike many other studied internationally active traders, that they nonetheless managed to travel around Europe and beyond, that they stayed in cities like Antwerp and Brussels, where there was only a very small Eastern Sephardic community, and almost no other Ottomans from Istanbul or Cairo. And also the fact that they did not settle in one place for a very long time, and as such also differ from majority of migrants who've been studied already in migration history, which often still is much focused on settlement rather than constant movement. And of course, also the fact that they married a Belgian woman is of course also interesting. Now, finally, what I also learned from this geography is that this type of itinerant traders from a modest background moving around the world was not a 19th century phenomenon. So it's not only because of globalization that we see these itinerant traders, but perhaps a more interesting question is how globalization impacted these itinerant traders. And I soon found many more such cases in the Belgian foreign files. Well, I should have shown this example earlier. So here you see an extract from the bulletin of Rafael Alcolombre from his foreign file. But I also found Algerians who were called Chukchuk by the Brussels population, or Chinese peddlers, of whom the most diverse rumors circulated in the newspapers. So there were various small minorities in Belgian cities who often consisted of groups of itinerant traders. And who regularly returned to Antwerp, Brussels, Ostend after stays abroad. And the foreigners police often created separate files for groups of these itinerant traders. For example, you can find files for Algerian peddlers, for Chinese peddlers, etc. And just like the individual foreigner files, they contain lists of related files. So here you see all file numbers of all Algerian peddlers in Brussels. There are police reports, which are often quite extensive, copies from individual files, and even newspaper articles. And in my opinion, these itinerant traders are the ideal group to help us gain better insights in the migration outside dense migration circuits and networks, and into migration which, at least at first sight, did not focus that much on settlement, but rather on constant movement. To conclude, my main research objectives are first to reconstruct the profiles and mobility trajectories of these itinerant traders, identify the main nodes and transfer points in Belgium, outside Belgium, and the ways and by whom these transfer points were used. Then second part is to analyze the channels of information and support, which in my opinion is especially interesting given the fact that they moved between a large variety of places where there was often no diaspora community awaiting them, definitely not for example, the Algerian or Chinese in Brussels. Definitely not at the time, maybe later there was. And finally, I want to investigate the long-term effects of the mobile lives of these itinerant traders on their life trajectories, not so much focusing on itinerant trades as a livelihood as such, which has been done by others already, but more on the people themselves and their trajectories in the long run. Voila.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Thomas. Very interesting presentation. And then we will move right away to a presentation by Amal Ihkan. I hope if I did not pronounce it right that you will correct me when you take the floor, Amal, with a presentation on the identity of Moroccan Jews living in Belgium and the Netherlands. And with the very interesting start of your abstract with the question of, do Moroccan Jews exist? Question mark, as a frequently asked question. Amal has a background in communication studies, so she has a BA and an MA in communication studies, and she has quite some experience in the media, and until last month was the spokesperson for the police of Brussels North, and has a whole trajectory of media experience before. But right now we're mostly interested about the identity of Moroccan Jews living in Belgium and the Netherlands. So without further ado, Amal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Veerle, for the nice introduction. I will immediately go to sharing the screen. I hope you guys are seeing it well. Voila. So thank you, first of all, to the Institute of Jewish Studies to invite me to talk about this subject. The reason why I chose this subject is, first of all, because there is actually a lack on academic research when it comes to Moroccan Jews here in Belgium and the Netherlands. And the second reason is because we all know the Ashkenazi community here. It's the largest group of, well, within the Jewish community in the both countries. But I was wondering, like, we don't know a lot about Moroccan Jews or Sephardic Jews. So with this master thesis, I wanted to shed a light on this small but no less important Jewish community. Which leads us to the the research question of the thesis, the meaning of the Moroccan Jewish identity for Moroccan Jews in Belgium and the Netherlands. Later on the presentation, I will clarify why I chose this concept exactly. First, I will tell you briefly about the research that has been done about the Moroccan Jews. The first academic research started around 1950, mainly done by academics with the Moroccan Jewish background themselves. For example, Chaim Zafrani was a pioneer when it came to Moroccan Jewish studies in history, in culture, and in the languages. Later on, there were several kinds of studies about the identity of Moroccan Jews, but the context was more in a nationalistic way. In the 50s, in the 60s, and 70s, nationalism was a very hot topic to research. So the main studies were about the religious identity, the national identity. And the only researcher I found was Daniel Schroeder from the University of Minnesota, who wrote about the concept of Moroccan Jewish identity in his study about Moroccan Jewish communities. And there he is saying that the concept is rather a phenomenon that existed after the independence of Morocco in '56. And before, it was not really used as a research concept. He says that it was actually used by Morocco to show it's a progressive country where the Jewish community is a very important part of the population. So the research question was about the Moroccan Jewish identity, but to understand this concept, it's very important to know where it comes from. So I tried to identify three concepts, which are the Jewish identity, the Moroccan identity, and the Moroccan Jewish culture. Because of lack of time, I can't go into detail with each of the concepts, but they're all described in detail in the master thesis itself. But I want to tell you more about the Moroccan Jewish culture because that contains cultural practices done by Moroccan Jews. In the pictures on the left, on the first picture, you see a food table on the Mimona festival. It's actually a holiday celebrated by Moroccan Jews after Pesach. It's actually a celebration with the Muslim community as well, a kind of interreligious holiday. On the second picture, you see the henna ceremony, which is done during the weddings, very common in as well the Muslim as in the Jewish community. And the last picture, you probably recognize the hand of Fatima, the Khamsa, which is actually used as a lucky charm or as an amulet to protect from evil stuff. And it's very symbolic actually for the Moroccan Jewish culture. For this study, I chose to do a qualitative research and in-depth interviews because it's a subject that is not being investigated yet, and because I wanted to collect in-depth information and to get to know the basics of this subject. That's why I also chose to do semi-structured interviews to keep room or to keep space for added interesting information from the respondents. In total, 7 respondents were included in the study. Therefore, I used the snowball method, a very efficient way to get in touch or get in contact with people from communities that are more difficult to approach. So this is how I got the 7 respondents. The initial idea was to at least have minimum 10, but due to time and practical reasons, that was impossible. That brings us to the results of all the interviews, which had really some interesting items. First of all, when I asked the respondents about their Moroccan identity, about how they see it, how they define it, how they perceive Moroccanness, the answers were very different. So not all of them identify themselves as being Moroccan. Some of them do, but it's pretty diverse. But what they all had in common is the way they talked about the Moroccan identity and Moroccanness. They all started to talk about their experiences within Morocco, or the nostalgic feeling they had, the stories they were taught about their parents or by themselves, or important life moments or life events that they experienced themselves in Morocco. And that was very common for all the respondents, even for the respondents as for the younger ones who weren't born in Morocco. What I also asked them is about how they identified themselves as being Jewish, what being Jewish means for them. And it was interesting to see that being Jewish and feeling Jewish was actually the first identity they identified themselves with, and was the most cultivated one as well. It's a way of life, like they call it. It's something that is being visible and is seen in their daily life. What was also interesting in that aspect was that being traditional Jewish or cultural Jewish was actually the most important thing, less than being religious Jewish. That was also clear by the practices they were doing, which were most of them cultural, like getting their kids to Jewish schools, being involved in the Jewish community, for example, the way they brought up their children. The religious practices were less done. For example, doing the Shabbat, eating kosher, celebrating the Jewish holidays. But what was also very interesting in that aspect is that the religious practices were done from a cultural motive. So it was not done by faith or because of religious reasons, but just because it's something they grew up with. It's their tradition. It's what they find important to do. So that brings us to the conclusion. The meaning of Moroccan Jewish identity is diverse, is actually not one concept, but is seen as two different kinds of concepts. The Moroccan identity as being an occasional one, an identity that is being perceived as nostalgic. And the Jewish identity is actually the first identity, the most cultivated as well, something that is seen in their daily life. And the Jewish culture is most important in that aspect. Voila, thank you all for listening. It's 10 minutes is really short to speak about this subject, so I can speak about it for hours. But I hope it was interesting. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. If you're interested to read my thesis, that's also possible. So voila, thank you again.
Well, thank you very much to both speakers.